From WXOJLP Northampton, 103.3 FM, your Valley Free radio station. Welcome. I'm Warren Odess-Gillette, and this is A Baha'i Perspective. A Baha'i Perspective is a radio program that presents a Baha'i perspective on life through interviews. If you want information specifically on the Bahá'í Faith, you're welcome to visit the website www.baha'i.org. That's BAHAI.org, or you can call the toll-free number 1-800-22-UNITE. Today I'm playing a telephone interview with Owen Allen, a Baha'i who grew up in rural Australia, went to the big city for boarding, high school, and university where he studied physiotherapy. He returned to the rural life after university by settling in a rural part of Queensland where he ran into the Bahá'í Faith. His mother's first reaction to Owen becoming a Baha'i was, "Why did you join a religion whose members get killed?" referring to the persecution of the Baha'is in Iran. I started the interview by asking Owen to describe where he grew up and what was it like growing up there.
I grew up in Atherton, actually a little town on the Atherton tableland in North Queensland, Australia, called Tolga. My family were a farming family. Yes, and I'm really back here for the last nearly 20 years now, have raised the family back here as well.
And you went to school there, elementary school?
Yeah, I went to primary school. Yeah, I went to primary school in the local primary school, and probably was appreciated by a lot of rural families in your part of the country. Got the school bus would arrive at the doorstep of the farm every morning and do the rounds until all the farm children were picked up and taken to the local primary school. In an odd irony, my own sons went to that. My older sons went to that same primary school. But when I got to the high school age, the feeling was maybe the local high school probably wouldn't have achieved the academic standard my parents hoped for us all, so we were packed off to boarding schools for high school. Not far away, but just down to Cairns, which is probably an hour and a half or a bit in those days, probably a bit more to drive down and back. So we went to a Catholic boarding school, got our academic graduations and in fact we all went to university.
And what did you study at university?
I studied physiotherapy.
Mm-hmm.
So that meant going here to Brisbane. University of Queensland was the only course of physiotherapy. I'm talking about 1976 when I entered university.
Mm-hmm. There
was only one other university had just been opened in North Queensland called the James Cook University. And it offered a few degrees, perhaps engineering and law and something like that in those days. Of other interest, of course, because I grew up in a farming family, we didn't really travel. So my degree of travelling up to the time I was 17 was probably 300 kilometres in every direction. So I wasn't really a well-travelled person and got on the large aeroplane to fly to Brisbane and saw skyscrapers for the first time in my life and that sort of thing at the age of 17. So it was a bit of a journey that even to today, we talk a lot in Australia in my field of work about the difficulty rural children, youth have of going to big cities, going to universities, and difficulties they have in adjusting to that lifestyle. Well, it was pretty difficult back in the late 70s.
How was it difficult for you when you went from the rural life to the city life?
I think the main difficulty was that you don't have any similar experience to draw from in your younger life. I mean, I didn't even have a city experience or, in a funny sense, I suppose the boarding school experience prepared me somewhat because I was a little hardened to being away from the home situation and I went to a college at the university, so I was a little bit used to living with a whole pile of other young people and that. However, the pros and cons are there. I had an older brother who had gone to university ahead of me. He had some friends, so there was a little bit of networking that soothed the way. Of course, I think virtually any youth going off to university quickly make friends. We had a lot of rural people there at the college I went to, and quite a lot of them, though, had been actually to boarding schools in Brisbane itself. So they had a much larger network and were much more comfortable with the environment. The other thing that's a bit of a difficulty in those days was boarding schools, particularly young men, were very strictly academic and sport orientated, and you know had very set study periods at night for homework, and they were all strictly enforced and supervised. And when you went to a university where you were your own person, you had to discipline yourself. You realised quickly, well, you weren't really used to that. And so there was a fairly high incidence of dropout rates from amongst my friends at university because simply they didn't have the internal self-discipline to do the study, even though, you know, in some cases they were what I would have considered had more inherent intelligence than myself. I took a year off at one stage because I was a bit confused about, you know, where life was leading, in a sense, in my course that I'd taken. And in a sense, when I look back at that, it was a little bit of the angst of trying to understand the world as well and your place in the world. The thing I wanted to do, even at that age, with some passion, was to, you know, get out and serve humanity in some way. I remember thinking, I forget this university and go and work in the third world country. Surely some volunteer organisation will have me. And of course, I quickly found that actually overseas volunteer organisations don't really want someone without skills. They want someone with a lot of skills. So I think that sort of educational process put me back into university to complete my degree and go on from there.
One of the basic teachings of the Bahá'í Faith is serving humanity. Now, you wanting to do that, did that occur before you were a Baha'i or as a result of you being a Baha'i?
Yes, I didn't run into the faith until I'd been working for some years.
How do you account for having this desire, helping humanity or serving humanity early on in your life? Was your family, how you were raised, was that a part of that, or what?
Look, I think there's a lot of influences. Certainly, even though in some way my family, you know, was isolated in the bigger social context. Well, in one sense, my grandfather was a pioneer of this area. He came from England in the early 20th century and made his way up to this area and become one of the new group of hybrid maize breeders, you know, in a very new era of science and agriculture in Australia. And that's what initially this area was based upon: large timber cutting, a bit of mining, and the growing of maize. So there was a bit of, I guess, initiative, motivation, I suppose, in the family heritage. My father also sort of did his own, even though he only went to 15 years old at high school. He became more or less a self-taught engineer and took on some of the early farm machinery and modified. I remember he bought case harvesters which came from America and modified them for the environment over here in the late 50s, early 60s. Unfortunately lost his foot in the process because he got it caught in one of the machines, but managed to carry on with a farming career with only one foot and a prosthesis. And I think there was a lot of talk about progress in a certain sense, and probably in an ethical sense. Little things, I mean, in the family stories, we had some Sikh friends that had come to Australia in probably in the 1930s as young men, and everyone else in the district knew one of these men that we knew fairly well, and they used to call him Peter, and actually we would get confused because we never knew who Peter was, because my grandmother had insisted we called him his proper name, which was Sarwan. You know, he said, you know, just take a bit of effort, and you don't need to sort of give a person a different name just because you can't, you know, pronounce it very easily. I think there were lots of little bits and pieces that had impact on what the world was about from those people. Interestingly enough, as I got into adulthood and after I became a Baha'i, I looked back and I realised the sort of holes in that socialisation, even though there were stories from when my grandparents came and started farming, stories about their interactions with indigenous people who were still really living a tribal life in the area. Then there's a whole gap in the family stories, and And it really has been difficult for me over the years to, fill in the gap of what happened to the Indigenous people in this area in that time, because when I started to know them, they were going to school with me and living in town and things like that. But again, we didn't socialise a lot with the Indigenous population. As I said, I finished my uni degree, and then at that stage I decided that, I hadn't seen anything of Australia, so I took a job in a remote part of Queensland, a very small town of 2,000 people, right in the centre of the state. Sheep raising country, wool country, flat land. You can get on the roof of a house and see for sort of miles and miles. Interesting in the sense that in Australia, the sheep population, as we call it, the sheep grazing population, tended to come from a background of perhaps initially maybe an upper class background, and so education is very highly sought. The grazing families call people in sheep and cattle in Australia graziers because they don't really feed their animals. They let them graze on very big stations, which is our term for ranches here, and they can be tens of thousands, and sometimes we just talk about them in how many tens or hundreds of square miles, and as you get right into the west. To have people who were into really the business of agriculture in a different way, and certainly were very well educated and sent their children obviously off to boarding schools and tertiary education.
Mm-hmm.
I was working in the health department in a hospital there, and then I come into contact with our institution of the Royal Flying Doctor Service, and in that area the Royal Flying Surgeon. And this was a surgeon who basically, had a pilot, and he was based in a larger town, but basically had, it was probably about a quarter of the state. If you think of it, that's probably equal to one of your states in America in geographical size, and that was his area, and they would fly from town to town and have a surgical list and operate, and if there was an emergency or an accident, any time of day or night, they'd get in the plane and fly to it. And it opened my mind to sort of, I guess, the start of the possibilities. People would come from overseas who are medical students just to come and have some experience in this service. And it was then through them that I started to say, there's not only this bigger Australia, there's actually a bigger world out there. And so that little story probably tells a bit of a story about how the mind in terms of the world and what it was at that era really needed a bit of training, I think. And that was probably precursor to my understanding about the Baha'i Faith when I actually met the Baha'i Faith later on.
Right. So how many years were you in the Queensland area?
I was just, at that stage, went out for a job, and I stayed a year. I suppose somewhere in the back of my mind was always this idea that I needed to move around, learn about things. So I decided after a year I'd learn enough there, and I found a little job actually back in this town that's my hometown, and I did a what we call a locum, a relief job for 6 months, and then went back to another western Queensland town called Roma. Again, got another bundle of experience. But it was at that time that I really started to think that aspects of the socialisation that we tend to do in Australia, which was a lot mixed up with drinking alcohol, and that I was saying, this doesn't really suit me, and this lifestyle isn't really sort of where I want to be. I started to read a little bit more. Interestingly enough, in those days, you might remember we had the Hare Krishnas were very strong, probably in America, Australia, England, and you'd see them on street corners if you went into a city, often playing music and handing out literature. And I'd collected a bit of this, and so I read I think the Bhagavad Gita at the age of 23, and thought, that's interesting. But what I got from it was a bit of a nuance of, even though it was a bit strange, in other ways it sort of resonated in terms of, it's a little bit like Christ's teachings in some ways. There was a lot of resonance there from my education as a Catholic, I guess. So I started sort of, I suppose, patching together a bit of an idea. There's this big world out there. There's these multitude of religions I don't really know much about. I'm sort of drifting in a spiritual and sort of mental space at that stage. So I returned to prayer, and I decided to go to another job, which was back in Cairns here, closer to us, and I was in a period of considerable prayerfulness, I guess, at that stage, saying a lot of prayers regularly about this issue of, what should I really be doing in life? What's the answers to this conglomeration of activity in the world? And I turned up at my job in Cairns, and within a month, as I was trawling the library one day, I saw a little brochure on the notice board saying, talk at the library on such and such a night by a Dr. Taib, sponsored by the Bahá'í Faith. And I thought, well, I hadn't heard of this one, and that's a strange sort of a sounding name for a doctor. But I thought, as we say, in for a penny, in for a quid or something. And so I went to listen to this talk, which was largely a doctor from an Iranian background who was talking about nutrition and psychology. He was a psychiatrist by training, but he also introduced the concept of religion and reading writings from religion as part of health. And that was a bit of an interesting angle too for me. And as I talked to people who were there, who later on I realized that many of them were Baha'is, I was invited, of course, to firesides by some of them.
Firesides being informative Baha'i meetings?
Well, yes, it was just a small hangout discussion type of activity in someone's home. I mean, when I look back at it, I sort of chuckled to myself because I remember talking to a couple of young men there. One was one of your co-nationalists, an American who had moved into Cairns, a musician. The other, in fact, I think they were both Americans. The other was a helicopter pilot who was working in Papua New Guinea, if I remember. And I had no contact with him, so I don't know much about where he ever ended up. As we were talking, I was saying, well, it occurs to me that we live in a global society, and I thought I was coming up with a new idea. Later on, I realised after I'd been to a couple of firesides that I was perhaps coming up with a bit of an old idea. Perhaps that's what led these young men to invite me to a fireside in any case. The thing was, yes, there was a lot of like-mindedness going on in those discussions at that stage.
Just to backtrack a little bit, you made reference to going or returning to prayer. It sounded like you had some sort of spiritual life growing up that you might have let go for a while and then sort of returned to.
Quite interesting. It sometimes is a question that comes to me, and even some of my friends ask it of me. Maybe of themselves are asking it. For some reason, in fact, probably out of my whole family, when I was somehow attracted to religion. So I think even before I went to school, one of my aunts was very religious in a Christian sense. I think she's a Baptist now, and I'm not sure whether she declared herself strictly a Baptist in those days, but she read the Bible, and I liked the stories and I liked the sense of them even from an early age. And when we went to school in Australia, we have a system of religious education in state schools. So it's a period the state government education department says we set aside an hour or two every week, and if a religious organisation wants to teach their congregation of children in the school, they can take that time to do so. So as a baptised Catholic, I was sent to the Catholic classes, and I think quickly was enamored with the stories and the sense of spirituality and sacrifice of Jesus. And that really grew, even though my mother and father were my father wasn't religious at all, even in that name. He tended to feel, I think, that he was a Christian by action, but couldn't really abide by religious organisation. My mother was from an Irish Catholic family, and that tended to mean, well, you were a Catholic by birth, even if you didn't do much about it. Mm-hmm. So they never really went to church much. My other brothers and sisters didn't really take on the same level of interest that I seemed to do. When I went to boarding school, as a Catholic boarding school, was a boon in some ways because I did learn a lot from or Marist Brothers Order about, I guess, some of the more higher order ethical circumstances in the history of Catholicism, maybe Christianity. And of course there was access to chapel and churches and even a local cathedral. And, when I was 13 or so, my voice was, still good enough to sing in the choir. And so, yes, there was, I think at that early stage, there was a sense that a very strong love relationship with Jesus and God and the spiritual feeling. The interesting thing was around about 14, 15, I suppose, was I started to realize that my questions were outgrowing the answers that I was actually getting from the clergy and that were around me. And that became an interesting time. So even though for the rest of those next couple of years, I still followed through on the religious commitments.
Owen, what were those questions that were starting to outgrow the answers?
Interestingly enough, they were probably fairly, basic questions of social life, but they were things like, because in the Catholic Church you have very obvious differential between the priests who don't get married and the rest of the congregation who get married and raise families. So those issues about, what's this thing about marriage and what's so important about what's the connection between spirituality and marriage? And spirituality seemed to be tossing it all on the side and not getting married. And most of the people are getting married and seem quite so there were probably those types of social questions. Mm-hmm. There were some dissonances between behaviour and the talk as well. So in a boarding school at that day, the clergy who ran the boarding school were mostly men who had not got married and weren't with family, and they were really trying to guide young teenage boys through a puberty process. And so there was a slightly abusive, I think, approach to how you educated young men. A lot of caning and hitting and violence and things like that. So yes, it just raised I think a lot of dissonance about what all that means. I guess the other thing which does come to me, which did occur to me at that time, was the big issue of, you have a Bible which has a whole pile of Moses. You have, before that you go back to Adam, and then since Moses, you have a whole pile of lesser prophets all writing and teaching the people, and then you have Jesus, and then you have for 2,000 years nothing, in a sense. Right. You have this Catholic Church with its big organisation grows up, but in terms of this guidance, this really strong spiritual guidance coming through, that didn't seem to be the case. And I wondered a lot about, well, why did the guidance sort of stop with Jesus? Mm-hmm. And if Jesus said he was going to return, that was all very well, but I didn't get a sense from the clergy that were teaching me religion that they actually believed that. It was a glossed over bit of the process. Of course, it was probably quite different from people's experience who grew up in the more Protestant traditions at that time, where maybe a little bit more emphasis was being put on, when Jesus returns. But it certainly wasn't in my Catholic upbringing. And I wondered about that, and I wondered, well, if he says he's going to return, he should return, and when and how, and it didn't make a heck of a lot of sense what that was about. And so when I was probably in university, that question probably made me put the Bible into more or less an ethical story category of learning experience. Mm-hmm. In other words, I stopped believing Jesus was going to return. I stopped believing that the stories were really literally true, even historically true, in any real sense, and basically started to think of them as messages, ethical
right.
Might as well have just been Aesop's fables, right. in a different form. For some years then I had drifted away from a real religious belief. Interestingly enough, I held on to the belief, I couldn't divulge the belief in God. There was something just strongly within me at that time that said that, there had to be a creator, or at least it was quite on the cards there was a creator of some sort. whatever the rest of this, whatever was happening in the world, perhaps we could unravel it with that help. And I think a certain sense of the concept that I sort of held on to at that time, and I think I still hold on to a lot to today, is first trust in God, then everything else will turn out okay. And I think that was where I was dabbling, mentally, probably socially, wasn't really quite sure where everything was going or how it was going to turn out, but I guess I held on to that real thread. And through reading some of the other religions eventually, even about, Buddhism and Hinduism, and in those days, you might remember in the early 80s, late 70s, there were movements of things like transcendental meditation. They had sort of little rituals of meditation that people were, becoming exposed to, were a bit popular in some circles. And so I took some of these techniques with me, and I thought, well, you can, if you're going to have, say, some prayers over and over, well, maybe whatever prayer you said would be okay. And I knew one prayer, which was really the Lord's Prayer from a Christian background, so I remember saying that an awful lot. At one stage, just in sort of a whole bundle of time, over and over again. And I think in some way, it's both created some spiritual direction, maybe some awareness in the mind, created a sense of fine-tuning, I suppose, of the mind for the things to look out for in a spiritual context. And I know that I looked at different areas of, spirituality that came by. It was probably really the beginning of what became known as the New Age movement at that stage. And so there were quite a lot of different spiritual notions going around. And I found it interesting that some of them you could pass them by easier, I suppose, than others. And I think that had to do with the prayer and the meditation, the developing the spiritual fine-tuning at a very fundamental level. And I think later when I read Baha'u'llah's writings about it, I saw the sense of that, that you really, you can start to sift the, what is really, in Australia we call it fair dinkum, fair dinkum spiritual content from the sort of perhaps more trivialized practice or a ritual that might become known as spiritual, but is really just a bit of a ritual. And also the depth of the teachings themselves. I think some teachings, New Age teachings, spiritual teachings, are at such a transparent depth, that they don't really hold you. They don't really hold your heart very strongly, really. And when I eventually read the writings of Baha'u'llah, it was really like, some giant magnet that just sort of grabs hold of you and says, this is the serious stuff,
So you went to these firesides.
Yeah. And
then what happened?
Well, I can remember sitting in my first fireside and saying, all right, this is a Baha'i Faith. What's the Baha'i Faith about? And and getting the whole lot. And in fact, I didn't have any questions until it really dawned on me that these people were saying that there weren't only one manifestation of God, there were two. And not only Christ had returned, but there were two manifestations of God, and I remember saying.
And you're referring to, and I just want to give a little background for folks, when you're saying you found out not only there was one, but there were two, being the Bab, which is Arabic for the gate, was the precursor to Baha'u'llah. For a background of who the Bab and Baha'u'llah are, you can go to Baha'i.org and you can get a historical account of the lives of the Bab and Baha'u'llah. So
yes,
go ahead.
Thanks. Australia is largely an agnostic society. We have at the moment probably less than 50% of people declared a religion. And certainly we have very, very small numbers of people who go to church on a regular basis. And we have a high level, I would say, of people who would be confirmed atheists. In that social context that you're coming from, people don't have a natural acceptance of real religion as people with prophecies and visions and things like that in their life. And as I said, I'd left that behind. I'd decided that was all stories, that was just good stories to base an ethics on. But then to sit in a room with some people who said, oh no, there's, there's renewed revelation. that's a strong, very strong thing to be getting across.
Right.
That's not to say that it's, overwhelmingly strong, but I think there might be a lot of people that would need a lot of maybe getting used to the idea.
So what happened to you, Owen, when you heard that?
I think, interestingly enough, it started drawing up all the old biblical lessons that I'd had about prophecy and about the return of Christ and things like that. On the one hand, I was very, very interested, of course, in the teachings of the Bab and Baha'u'llah for a new world society. I was incredibly interested in that because they really paralleled a lot of my own thinking at the time. And so I wanted to read more about it. I obviously wanted to read more about the basically spiritual enterprise, how you become a more spiritual person. So I was really interested to read about what they had to say about that. The issue of them being a manifestation of God was a question that then needed to be, because it was out there in my mind, needed to be answered in my mind. In other words, I either needed to, if the claim was there, I needed to place it in the true basket or the false basket very firmly for myself. So, yes, I kept going back. The people that I had close contact, I got on very well with them. I could drop around to their place and have a cup of tea and ask them questions, and I'd read. My teachers were pretty hard on me, I think about the third book they gave me was God Passes By. They were tough.
Yeah, so describe why that was a difficult book.
Well, this was God Passes By is largely a historical work written by the great-grandson of the founder of the Bahá'í Faith, who was the head of the Bahá'í Faith at the time, a man called Shoghi Effendi, and he was known to us, and still known to us, as the guardian of the faith. And as one of his goals, he translated a lot of the writings from Arabic and Persian into English, and he also exposed the history of the Baha'i Faith in some detail to Baha'is, particularly Western Baha'is who didn't have access to that information up to then. But he had been to Oxford University for the purpose of developing a strong ability in English. So he wrote a very strong prose, often with very long sentences with several concepts within each one. And really, in that first reading, I can remember, just being left with images of hardship and snow-covered mountains and chains and prisons, and it was a bit like that, I think.
Right. All the things Baha'u'llah endured.
Yes, that's right. I mean, so it was a history of their life, the exile that Baha'u'llah was sent to because he was really supporting a claim that went against the accepted norms of the clergy and the government in Persia in the 19th century.
Mm-hmm.
I think a little bit the reason why my friend gave me that book was because of, I suppose, the perhaps slightly academic questions that I was asking. At some level, yes, I handled it okay, but at another level, it's a big work to go through, and I'll probably still, use it as a reference book, and you still end up reading books like that in bits and pieces over the years because you just never get to the bottom of them. However, the crucial question for me at the end of the day was I had a fear of making the wrong decision about that.
Mm-hmm.
And that fear really stemmed back to the religious education of hell and damnation, if you choose the path of the devil, and unfortunately for a lot of religious education, I think the path of the devil isn't the path of wrongdoing, it's the path of just having a different idea.
Mm.
And that, again, was a really hard but I think necessary concept for me to get hold of, was that it was fear-induced education. That, in fact, at a prophecy level, you could clearly show that Baha'u'llah fulfilled all the conditions of the return of Christ, but that I realized that wasn't really necessarily the education that was being given around, one religious view against another. In my younger education, it was more that people were what we called patch defending. In other words, the Baptists would say the Catholics will go to hell, and the Catholics would say all the Protestants would go to hell. And that was because they were just wrong and didn't really believe in Christ and all this sort of thing. And of course, I think that's a really, when I look back to it, and I think for today, I think that's a really damaging type of idea to give to children of any religion. It's damaging for themselves. It makes it, puts them in a really bad mental state situation. And I think as we're seeing in the world today, from some quarters, it just becomes ultimately destructive to society in a very literal sense. But having got through that, having got through the fear, and really working out that this is a bit of a test for me in a spiritual sense, if I've put all the bits together, at some stage I've got to take the big step. And that was something that was just going through my own mind. The people that I was going to firesides with were quite relaxed about the whole situation. They were, just happy for me to turn up and ask hard questions if I could, and that was that.
No arm twisting going on.
That's right, yeah. There was no, I never came under any sense that the people were in any way creating that same stress as well, like saying to me that if you don't believe in the Baha'i Faith, you'll go to hell, so you better hurry up and believe in the Baha'i Faith and all that sort of things. But it didn't take me that long. I mean, I think a couple of months of really fairly solid investigating and thinking and praying, I'd convinced myself that Baha'u'llah was indeed a manifestation of God. And not only that was the answer to the prophecies of the Bible, and I was able to confirm my belief in Baha'u'llah in that sense very strongly.
Now, Owen, was there an immediate impact to what you were doing in your life when you became a Baha'i?
There was an impact. It wasn't something that was really dramatic, but it was the impact of going from what you might call wishy-washy to a set commitment. And by that I mean that, as I said earlier, for some years I wasn't happy with the socialisation that I was involved in, particularly around drinking and the way that we just tended to do things as young people in Australia at the time. So then, although I didn't drink very much, to actually make a commitment saying I'm a Baha'i now and I don't drink at all, that's a strong social impact. And it does, after a while, you realise that you don't lose your friends, but what you do is you stop necessarily going to the same parties they go to because you get a bit bored with them. Right. The reality is that socialisation that occurs around a lot of drinking is actually just plain boring. So I just drifted away from those types of events and functions, and you seek socialisation in other forms. So there's a bit of a change in the way you do things, and I think then you start reorganising some priorities in life because the Baha'i Faith itself has certain structures. I don't know if you've talked about them on your program, but things like a regular community meetings we call the 19-day feast, and there's holy days because there are events, historically important and sacred events in the Baha'i Faith around the Bab and Baha'u'llah and the Revelation. The Baha'i Faith doesn't have clergy, but it does its own administration, so there's an administrative detail to become involved in. And then there's the big mission of Baha'u'llah, which is really to promote those teachings, his teachings throughout the world, which is to engage the people in the world, in every community of the world, with these concepts of what is it to be a world citizen? How do we eradicate prejudice from the world? How do we bring humanity together? How do we raise the status of women? How do we educate all the children? How do we ensure proper scientific progress without any destructive elements? How do we achieve world peace? So these teachings of Baha'u'llah that go towards solving these problems become very important and very important priority for a Baha'i, and something that I took fairly seriously, although again I wasn't sure how to do the job. It sort of bumbled around. However, I did have some, again just by I suppose environment, being within the Baha'i environment and being in Cairns, about a year after I had declared my faith in Baha'u'llah, I met a man who was living in New Guinea. He wasn't a national Papua New Guinea man. He was, I think, he was Indian or maybe even Sri Lankan by background. And he was in Cairns because of his son, who had been born, had some particularly rare types of medical problems that needed to be treated in Australia. And I was thinking of doing some travelling. And I said to him, look, I'm really having trouble putting together a bit of a travel package where I can be of assistance to this teaching of the Bahá'í Faith, teaching of Baha'u'llah's work. And he said, just come to New Guinea. We've got plenty of work and we can put you on a plan. And so, I did. I got the visa and went to New Guinea, not for a long time, just for 6 weeks. Mm-hmm. And it was interesting. Look, I have to just backtrack a little bit. You asked before about impacts of the Baha'i Faith. And
right.
When I actually investigated the faith and decided I was going to become a Baha'i, one of the first things I did was I travelled up to where my parents live, and I said to them, look, I've joined this religion called the Baha'i Faith. My father, who was very disinterested in religion, didn't say much at all. I think he grunted or something. My mother said two things. First thing she said, what was wrong with your other religion? And the second thing she asked was, and why would you pick a religion that they kill people in? And I looked at her and I said, how would you know anything about that? And she said, I've read about the Baha'i Faith for years.
Wow.
And she hadn't said anything to me, and before I met Baha'is, I had no knowledge of the faith. So,
really,
it's interesting, the dimensions of knowledge and what people do with them, I guess, the decisions they make about them.
Very interesting.
And then I realized that the aunt that used to teach me the Bible when I was a child, she worked in a big apartment store and as an office manager, and one of her workers, many years before, had become a Baha'i. And of course, she wasn't really happy about that, and she wasn't really happy with me becoming Baha'i because I was, because she was a strong Baptist and she didn't think this was leading in the right direction.
Right.
Nonetheless, she accepted it and has accepted it with good grace, and as I eventually married an Iranian Baha'i woman, my aunt, we've enjoyed very good relations and friendships over the years.
Yeah, you probably have expanded her horizons.
One thing that I've been surprised, I think, to learn is that at least there's, in Christianity at least, the people who I've mostly met who are committed Christians are committed to the tolerance concepts, the Good Samaritan concept. So they might say, you're not, this is hell and damnation, but, they won't strike you out for it. So this might be different. Obviously, I've read enough and heard enough stories to know this is not the same in all parts of the world and in all situations. But I have been generally comforted in Australia by the fact that the Christian community has that general attitude, that even though you don't see eye to eye, you can still be friends and still work together at different levels. And in fact, if you talk at that level of just, what's a moral way to live life, for example, you've still got a lot to talk about with each other.
I hope you enjoyed that interview with Owen Allen, an Australian Baha'i who is a physiotherapist. For a copy of this and other interviews, you can go to the website www.abahaiperspective.com. For information specifically on the Baha'i Faith, you can go to the website www.baha'i.org, or you can call the toll-free number 1-800-22-UNITE.